Welcome everybody to our launch panel event for our 2025 Broadcast Trends Report. Here at Broadcast Revolution, we have been surveying over the last few months the general public, broadcast journalists and PR professionals such as yourselves to understand what some of the changes and challenges have been to broadcast journalism, what kind of news the people of the UK are listening to, how they're tuning in, and what opportunities this is going to present for PRs as you look into 2025. The purpose of this webinar and the report, which you will have available to you after this, is all about giving you, our PR audience, the tools, insights and means as you enter into planning season for next year and look to roll out your campaigns. Before I introduce properly our panel and we kick the discussion off, I'm just going to go over a few housekeeping bits if that's okay. After this webinar, we will be sharing the details of how you can access our report. As well as this, we are going to be offering one-on-one broadcast surgeries. So that's when our team of broadcast consultants will be coming into your offices to come and meet your teams to talk about your plans for 2025, where we can share our consultancy and where we can sort of expand on some of the insights that we're going to cover in this afternoon's session. So please do keep an eye out for our poll that's going to be coming up at the end of this. And please indicate if that's something that you'd be interested in hearing a little bit more about. We're going to be talking for about 45 to 50 minutes between us, our panelists, but then I'm going to be coming to questions from the audience. So please do pop your questions into the Q&A function, or you can also tweet us at Broadcast Revo with your questions as well, and then we will come to you. So for the next hour, I'm going to be speaking to our fantastic panel. We're going to be talking about everything that we cover in our report. We're going to be talking about trust. We're going to be talking about the role of social media, YouTube and podcasts. We're going to be talking about the challenge of representation and diversity. And how do we continue into 2025, really evaluating and measuring the work we do and the impact that it has. So I'm really pleased to be joined by our fantastic panel. First of all, Theo Usherwood, who's a political journalist and broadcaster who's worked across Global, LBC, Times Radio, BBC, Sky News, to name a few. Aarti Bulsara, from the Board of Directors at Hope and Glory, who's worked with brands including Subway, B&Q and Greggs. And Simon Feldman, who's worked in PR for, I think, 17 years, I think I've got that right, and has worked in-house for an array of consumer brands, but currently is the ESG and DE&I communications lead at Virgin Media O2. Thank you, everybody, for joining us this afternoon. I think first what I would love to get into is a quick reflection on 2024, because it's been a very politically charged year. And obviously we're saying this just as Donald Trump has made it as the 47th president to go back into the White House. But as well as kind of the politics, we've seen large sporting events, we've seen big kind of cultural and music moments. And I think what's been really fascinating about our report is how those big sort of moments have drawn audiences into tuning into broadcast, TV and radio. Our stats show that 62% of adults say that they've increased their consumption of news around sort of key events like the general election that we had here in the UK and the Olympics. So Theo, I guess I just want to start with you and get your thoughts on how broadcasters have had to kind of really tap into these big moments and what kind of content they've been having to put together in order to hold on to these audiences past these moments.
Well, broadcasters always knew, good afternoon, they always knew that 2024 was going to be a big year and they planned for it. They initially planned for an autumn general election. It didn't happen. And I think many were caught on the hop in terms of their planning diaries when that when the general election was announced at the end of May. And that caught people slightly unawares. And if anything, I think it probably slightly dampened down the amount of resource that went into the general election. Overall, I would say that the result that we saw in the early hours of yesterday was more consequential for this country than July's general election. Yes, it was a switch from the Conservatives to Labour, but in Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer, you have sensible and sensible. With Joe Biden and Donald Trump, I think 2025 is slightly like the
That's
unknown.
sensible.
is the unknown, and I think that's the most that's the most diplomatic way of putting it. From everything in terms of what happens in the Middle East to, of course, Europe as well. I think the knock-on impact of that election result is going to be significant. But in terms of broadcasters, a huge amount of resource has gone into the last year, and I think one thing I would finally say on this is that with Trump you get volatility, you get uncertainty, and that means that news continues to hold a value, and that if there was any signs of contractions in the news industry, I think those will probably dissipate. And actually, I think 2025 is going to be another big year as we look particularly in international politics, geopolitical situation. I think it's going to be a much bigger year than it would otherwise have been had Harris and Democrats won.
No, I think that's interesting, and I definitely want to come on to 2025 and the outlook and what we think going to be some of the big stories that might be sort of relevant to our audience. But I think if we provide a quick snapshot of our sort of what we looked at in our report was how many people are kind of tuning into broadcast as well as other sort of media channels. TV was voted the top channel that people will watch on a daily basis, followed by YouTube, and we've got Facebook, and then radio coming in fourth. Simon, I suppose from your point of view, working in-house as a brand, what was your sort of response to seeing some of these figures around how people are consuming their media? Has it changed your plans for sort of 2025? Or, it would just be good to get your thoughts on that.
I think it's a continuation of what we've been doing over the last couple of years, where it's such a layered approach. So when I work on a story, I'm always thinking about, right, what's the aim? Who are we trying to reach? What tactics are we going to go with? So what's the broadcast strategy? What's the social strategy? More so now, I'm now thinking about podcasts. It's really interesting that Theo was talking about the different events that we've had in 2024. For me, what got me really into podcasts this year was the election, the UK election, and that has continued. And I know think we'll come on to it later, but I'm really thinking about what more can we do to make our campaigns really targeted and reach consumers even more deeply. And I think that is through broadcast, because you can have those conversations. So I think my reflection of this year and then looking ahead to next year is a bit more of the same, with a layered approach and how we can reach consumers more directly, in a more targeted way. And I think you have to do it that way, because it is harder to land news, especially it has been a volatile year. We're going to probably go into another volatile year. So you really have to think about what's the story, what's the message, and how you're going to reach. And it isn't a linear way. It can't just be stick a press release out. It can't just be, let's try and get it in one online title. It needs to be broadcast, influencers, podcasts, and so on.
Yeah. And I think we definitely need to have a discussion about how people are kind of consuming news as well, because one of the things that we looked at in this year's report was actually, whilst trying to look at what are the different platforms and people are using to access their news, what kind of news consumer you are. So we had people who they categorise themselves as short, snappy scroller. They want to watch sort of very quick form videos for their news and interviews. They want to be scrolling through their feeds, versus people who are more interested in that longer form content like the podcast. They want to actually read their newspaper. Aarti, how does that, if you're looking at essentially how consumers having a very kind of mixed media diet across different platforms, how does that sort of feed into kind of your role in terms of you're a PR agency, you're responding to briefs, in terms of how are you going to tap into all these different kind of platforms for your client?
I think it's similar to what Simon was saying. It's about that integrated approach. And I think for clients, it's making sure the content that we create works really hard for them and that it goes across multiple channels. I don't think it's siloed anymore. I don't think, your report found that a lot of the broadcast journalists are not only working on their main programming, they're also having to create content for their social channels. So there's a great opportunity for PRs in terms of the stories that they create and the content that they're creating, that it could work across multiple platforms. And on the flip side of that, there's no reason why that content that can't drive coverage and conversations into traditional media channels as well. I think what I found really interesting was the growth of YouTube and Facebook, particularly from a news consumption perspective. Like, that is huge at the moment. When I think about the election just 4 years ago, I was watching that on the BBC. This week I was watching, the live broadcast of This Is Politics. That's just in 4 years we've seen that change. And I think it's also thinking about your audience, because I think I read a stat the other day that 18 to 35-year-olds are more likely to get their news content from TikTok and Instagram than they are from the BBC. So really thinking from your client's perspective about who your audience is and where they're going to be actually meeting them is really important.
Yeah, I think maybe we can stick with this sort of conversation about online and different platforms, because I do think it's really interesting, because we've seen, and maybe I can come to you, Theo, we've seen obviously in 2024, back end of 2023, broadcasters like Talk TV coming off the air, so to speak, and moving on to YouTube. We know that YouTube is such a prevalent and important place now for podcasts, as Aarti mentioned, to kind of grow audiences. Do you kind of see that might be something that continues in 2025? We're going to see more broadcasters pushing towards YouTube. Is everything headed there?
Well, the first thing, there are a few points to make just on YouTube. The first thing to say about YouTube is the advantage it has is that it's a relatively stable platform. It's not like X, and it offers journalists particularly more stability, I think, than Facebook. It's less subject to algorithm changes, the way it's managed, and I'm not an expert on these sort of behind the scenes algorithms, but from everything I hear from where I've been working is that it has much greater stability than other social media platforms. The other thing to say about YouTube is that it tends to, where I've been working and seen it in action, it's for an older generation. The two numbers in that breakdown I think are most interesting are Instagram and TikTok. And I think it's at 45% and 54%.
Yeah.
I've got that right. And I think we're going to see those expand. I was speaking to somebody who works in television the other day. We had a cup of coffee and he was like, YouTube's just, he'd met a young person who said YouTube's just for old people. The youth of today are all about Insta and TikTok, and I know one radio presenter, fairly prominent name, who's made a great success of actually bringing just a young digital guy just to do his TikTok profile. So that's the other thing. Just on YouTube, finally, is that and this would be my slight word of caution about it, is that it only gets you so far if you get onto a YouTube channel. So for instance, I've been doing a podcast on the US elections for Times Radio, and we started with a slightly different format. YouTube, they've got a very successful YouTube channel, and we started with a slightly different format where we had two guests instead of one guest talking about, we tried to balance it off with the US election. We had a Democrat and a Republican of some shape or form. And actually we found that wasn't lending itself to the content, and we started to great content because the conversation became inevitably a bit disjointed. We also found when we used people who are more moderate in their views, it didn't get the views. So we were sort of bumbling around on sort of 10, 20,000 views. So if you get onto a YouTube channel, that's okay, but you may well find, unless you get the format right and you provide exactly what the broadcaster wants and knows is successful, then you're only going to hit a fairly low number of views. It was when actually we went back to what they'd done previously that suddenly we were well into six figures, because we got exactly what the consumer wanted of Times Radio, the YouTube channel. We provided them exactly the way they wanted it, and we asked the questions exactly how they'd been asked previously for other subjects, and that's when we got the success. So if you go on YouTube and you want to do YouTube, we get clients, whether influencers or celebrities, onto YouTube channels. Think very carefully about the content. It needs to be punchy. It needs to be maybe a bit controversial, and it needs to draw people in, and they need to be saying something. Getting onto YouTube isn't just on somebody's YouTube channel isn't just a win of itself. There's a whole nother layer to go. So rather than compare it to television or getting on the one show, there's so many viewers there. You've won. You've got your client on the one show. YouTube, you've got them on your YouTube channel. You're only halfway there.
And I think it's really interesting what you were talking about there in terms of that test and learn that you're having to do, or your team's having to do with YouTube. Because one of the areas that we covered a lot in the report and we asked broadcast journalists about was actually how their roles have had to change. So, we used to talk about sort of linear kind of programming, but actually the word is now content. And it's serving multiple audiences, those that are listening via that traditional means, and those that are then watching the short form interviews on TikTok, who are going to YouTube, for example, even if they're probably slightly older than those going on TikTok. But actually, it was 98% of broadcast journalists who said they have to create content to attract online audiences now. How I suppose, have broadcasters managed that kind of, I suppose your skill set has had to widen. You're becoming a YouTube expert as much as you are a producer for a linear program.
I started on a newspaper course in 2003-4, and it was print, magazine, PR, and then broadcast. And I was on the newspaper course, then went into a local newspaper and only ever just tapped away for the local paper. And then I went to, but if you don't adapt, you die, right? It's the same in journalism, and there are lots of people, lots of casualties. I worked with some old guys when I was at Press Association, and they sort of had a very old mindset. We had our patches, and there was a chap who worked in one patch, and he literally, the news desk would ring up and go, well, could you just go to Coventry today? And we're like, no, out my patch, boom, not doing it. And there's no, you've got to always change in journalism to try and stay relevant, and always look to new things and new ideas, and actually often it's the younger ones coming through who are really setting the lessons. I remember when there was the tragedy of the Grenfell fire. A very young journalist was working with us, and he went and he filmed the fire engines leaving the scene once the fire had been put out, and everybody applauding. 6 million views on Facebook. And I was like, we're like, whoa. And this was just, I'm there as an established journalist of more than 15 years, and some kids come in and just done 6 million views, and you just got to be like, you've got to adapt.
And I suppose on the other end of the spectrum, what we've found in our kind of surveys as we're talking about sort of skill set and this sort of pressure, I say pressure to be online, for want of a better word, but we found when we surveyed our PR professionals, 7 in 10 said that social media has meant they're expected to create campaigns that work across multiple platforms, not just traditional editorial channels. So, there's very much going off on sort of both sides. Aarti, is that something that you've sort of experienced in agency?
Yeah, definitely. I think that it's something that, campaigns don't live and die by their one platform that they're on. And I think there's that need to kind of create conversation and talkability and shareability of ideas across multiple platforms. So that naturally means that PRs need to know a little about everything, whether that's social media, whether that's traditional media, but also know in terms of creating those ideas, having that embedded, that strategy embedded, so that it does have that talkability within it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know we mentioned obviously the younger audiences, Instagram and TikTok is obviously the most important sort of place for them in terms of reaching that audience. But I think what we found is, there are still those that will listen to those kind of traditional broadcast or traditional print online as well. So I think even though that seems to be where, the majority of them are going, actually there's still a need to kind of think about the full kind of media sort of platforms really when you're putting together campaigns to target that audience. I'd love obviously then to talk about podcasts too, and maybe this is something I suppose you mentioned it earlier, Simon, in terms of actually for you personally, the election was what drove you to podcasts and your kind of love and finding podcasts. But I suppose for you as a brand, this is still probably quite a relatively untapped sort of space for PRs and brands. It's a booming industry, the podcast industry. And I think brands are still sort of navigating how they can slot into it and where they can find those opportunities.
Yes, absolutely. I think if we turn back the clock, and this was 10 years ago, I think it would be the same with social media and influencers, right? And, and beyond that is when the advent of Facebook and Twitter as was launched, and brands were like, how do I use that? Then when influencers came along, it's like, how do we work with influencers? And I think that has evolved, matured, and it's now when you partner with influencers, for example, you're always thinking about who is that right influencer for our brand? How do we land something that feels really authentic, because I think you when you work with influence, it can be very clear if something's authentic or not, and their followers will sniff it out. And I think now we're the same with podcasts, but I think it needs to be demystified. I think there's a big role that can be done and should be done to look at what is the opportunity, because there's so many podcasts out there, and it's working out what is the right podcast opportunity and how do you incorporate it for the campaign or your brand that you're working on. I don't actually think you can do sort of a one and done campaign. Aarti and I were talking about this earlier. I think if a brand is working on something and they want to work with a podcast, I think it needs to be on a campaign that they want to be known for, right? And I don't think it's sometimes it's great to do a one and done campaign. That's sometimes what you need to do, of course, in our industry. But if you're building something more broader, so some things that I work on around digital inclusion, about telling stories about how we're helping people get online, or the support that's out there to help parents keep their kids safe online, a really important topic. That is something that would lend itself, or a topic like that, to podcasters, right? You've got to find the right one, rather than just a kind of a one and done PR story. I think it's exciting because for me, when I listen to a podcast, I am invested. I think as a listener, you become invested to the podcast host. I mean, you've just seen it. So I think we talked about, Aarti, you listened to The Rest is Politics. The Rest is Politics and that series, they sold out the O2. They've sold out, I think, Madison Square Gardens for the US version. The Rest is Entertainment podcast, I mean, I'm totally a fan. It's selling out. They're going to be at the Royal Albert Hall and so on, the news agents, right? And you become invested with the host, and therefore they're able to sell out. So the opportunity is huge, but it's working out, how do I get that brand? How do I get my brand on there, right? How do I work with someone like Aarti at Hope and Glory to go help our brand to reach that audience, for that audience to take away that message? Because I think if you get it right, it's so powerful. And also, what we've seen is that young people also listen to podcasts, right? We know that, yes, you're right, they'll gravitate towards TikTok and YouTube, but they still listen to podcasts, right? And the way that it's now, podcasts are integrated on so many different platforms. So I think the opportunity is huge, but we have to work out, how do we get there? And also working out, will the podcast hosts take us? Will they want to work with PRs? I think they do. I think there is that opportunity. Yeah. But I think it's a little bit opaque. Aarti, what do you think?
Yeah, I agree. I think it's definitely an untapped area that's growing. I think from a PR perspective, there's a bit of work to be done in terms of finding the tools to be able to find the right podcast to work with. I think Simon mentioned, 10 years ago with creators and influencers, it was really hard to work out who the right person was to partner with. Now there are tools out there that really help you drill down into audience in terms of engagement. I think that's difficult at the moment with podcasts because it's not quite there. And I think when that does start to happen, there's a job for PRs to do to help clients understand who the right podcast partner might be, what those opportunities might be. At the moment, I think it's building relationships, as it always is for PRs, but really building those relationships with producers. I think there's also that celebrity element as well. When you work, we talked about this, Simon and I, when you work with a celebrity, that opens that door to be able to look at podcasts. But then there's also that element of, having a bit of independence as well. Many of the celebrities that we now work with also have their own podcasts, and then there's those issues around, how can we be independent but also credibility as well. So I think there's a lot of stuff to work through there.
And it's interesting, if I go back to us, the stat is everything you're both saying. 71% of PRs said they don't have a podcast strategy. It's still very much we think we should be doing something here. As you said, Simon, there's a really big opportunity. How do we navigate that? Whether that's sponsoring and getting them, tapping into an existing audience, whether is it, as you say, actually trying to land and place your spokesperson as interviews on podcasts, which is something obviously our team have started to do here as well. But then also, do you then create your own podcast?
That's what I was going to
do
come
you
on
create
to.
your own?
And that for me feels like I'll use blessing and a curse. I think there's two sides of it, right? The opportunity to create your podcast and be known to something is great, but you have to be in it for the long haul, surely, right? You have to set out your shtick. What is it that, if you're going to listen to that podcast, why are you going to be invested? Why are you going to come back? And I think that's, if you've got something that's really, that you think that you can build and build and build, and we've seen so many great brands do that, and podcasts that take time, but I think you have to be in it for long haul. I mean, you're the expert, so what do you think?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think there's still a bit of a nervousness and trepidation because it's to your point, you're in for the long haul. There's a lot of planning that goes into it. And we were discussing this actually just before we started the event. There's a lot of planning. There's a lot of that pre-production strategy that goes into it. And obviously an understanding that there's still an element of, because the podcast industry is still sort of growing, there's still such a huge reliance on organic word of mouth recommendations. I don't know what you think.
I think also just in some of the adverts that I've listened to a few podcasts, and I think what's interesting just about the way they do what I know from radio is live reads. So rather than just having say an advert and then the podcast, an advert and then the podcast. And I know Alistair Campbell does this around mental health charities, is that there'll be an endorsement from the presenter of the podcast. So there's a mental health counselling service, and if I remember this correctly, Alistair Campbell will do a live read about why mental health is really important to him, how counselling has changed his life, and why you should access this particular service that, of course, is paying for the advertorial, if you like, in the podcast. And that is actually, I think, what's really clever about the way they do it in that particular outlet is actually it's much more seamless than an advert just being plonked into the middle of the podcast. And I know when I listen to it, you don't necessarily think to turn down your iPhone
Some
or whatever.
Quite
You just
like them.
you carry on listening to it, and then it goes into the conversation about the politics of the day. The only other thing I say about podcasts, and this is I think something that audio, I think, intrinsically has over video, is that you can do something else as you're listening to a podcast, as you are listening to the radio, and that I think builds, a premium element. Now, I defer, of course, to your expertise, both in terms of, who do you go to or who do you team up with? But I think there's more than one opportunity there than trying to get the celebrity on the podcast, get the celebrity to mention the product, and then move on to something else. I think there's a much closer integration there that can happen.
And when you mentioned there about Alistair, one thing that also I think is a potential pitfall / opportunity is who you partner with. So if you have your own podcast, right, who is that host? Who's that trusted voice? Some of the podcasts that I listen to are with people who are more established, they've got their great interview style, and that also as a brand that you would feel trusted to put your talent or your brand on with that podcast, right? But I guess like anybody can have a podcast, anybody can set up a YouTube channel, but that doesn't, I guess perhaps I'm slightly old school. I always think about, well, who is the presenter? What's their, or the host, what is their take, right? How they're going to approach the subject. So there's so much to unpack and to almost be guided by, whether it is going down an established route or if you're going to create your own, who do you partner with and how do you create a safe and engaging environment? It's not straightforward. I think there's a lot there, but there's a lot to be unpacked. Yeah, you could.
It's a huge amount of work.
Yeah.
It's an incredible amount of work, and it's incredibly difficult to start from scratch. It took the newsagents for West Politics. They brought in like the biggest names who worked together, and who bounced off each other, and then they bought the best. And they got the best product, and then still we've seen growth. They didn't get Madison Square Gardens, and they didn't get the Albert Hall on day one. It has taken a huge amount of effort and forethought and planning that goes into it. And if I was trying to manage that in house or for an agency, that's a huge amount of commitment.
But I think what we always talk about though, and I remember in one of our previous events, we had Global's head of comedy and entertainment podcasts, and he was talking about how a friend of his created this small sort of podcast. I think it was all to do with kelp. He was some sort of expert in kelp, but he had even though it was a small audience, they were incredibly engaged with him, really interacted with the podcast, and so he had such fantastic engagement. And what we discussed was this idea that even if you don't necessarily have the biggest community, actually with podcasts, it may be slightly less. You may not necessarily be up with the likes of the rest is politics, the rest is entertainment. But what you can create is a really engaged community that are then going to invest in what you've got to say, and then you can use it as a platform to campaign about other things that are related to your brand. So I think we could talk about podcasts for the rest of this session, but there are a couple of more areas that I would really love to touch on that we sort of talk about in the report, and I'm sort of bridging with podcasts because one of the sections of our report looks at sort of this idea of trust in media. Who are the most trusted media channels? Where does the role of kind of AI, fake news kind of, come into that whole discussion? And interestingly, 1 in 4 adults said to us that they do not fully trust any of the major news sources. And actually some of journalists themselves said, look, we think we're only moderately trusted. And that's not necessarily personal to us as the brand, the media brand. It's just where the kind of element of, this sentiment of trust is at the moment with us as sort of like a society. The nature is to distrust first and then verify, which is really interesting when we saw that actually broadcast journalists said overcoming that fake news is still, a challenge for 7 in 10 of them, and actually policing that growth of AI as well, and where that kind of comes into it, I think is really interesting too. And I suppose I'll just maybe come to you, Simon, in terms of this idea of trust and looking at some of the titles that even though we've got, a quarter of adults that don't fully trust, actually those that do trust, they're trusting in broadcast, they're trusting in TV and radio, and from some of those main media outlets that we know. How much does that sort of feed into you as a brand? Because obviously trust is hugely important for you, and with your own customers.
Yeah,
how does that play within your kind of PR media plans?
I think it always comes back to the story that we're trying to tell, right? And especially with proactive stories, what comes up for me is, why my brand? So why Virgin Media O2? What's our license to be talking about this issue? What's our skin in the game? Why do we have an authority to be talking about the story? And once you can crack that, then you're down the path, right, of why you should be trusted, because we've got a role to play, right? We're in people's homes up and down the country. We power the connectivity for people's phones. Like, we're an essential part of people's lives in a way. But that doesn't mean we have a right to play on every single story. So it's working out what our role is, demonstrating that. And as I said earlier, it's about layering up that campaign. How do you make it more substantial? So do you have a case study, right? Or does your spokesperson, can they talk with empathy? Can they talk with lived experience? Although you've not talked about trust there, I'm a big believer in making sure that when we work with talent or campaigns, that we're thinking about with diversity, DE&I in mind, right? Because how do we reach all of Britain, not just one part of Britain? And I think that I think that's all part of that trust conversation. So it starts at the very beginning for me, the planning, and then building it out from there. And also holding up the mirror, right? And being brave and saying, I'm not sure about this. I'm not sure that we should be saying this. I'm not sure that we've considered every angle. I'm not sure that the talent or the influencers or the idea itself represents Britain, right? And it's going through all those steps, right? And we've seen time and time and time again where brands who might have done something of good intention then leads to, good intentions don't always lead to good outcomes. And we've seen that time and time again. And I don't want to work on a campaign like that. I don't want to be involved in a campaign like that. I don't think morally, ethically, or professionally it's right.
Aarti, I don't know what your thoughts are in terms of some of what we talked about in terms of like trust and representation. It's still a staggering amount. I think it's something like 1 in 3 people actually say, 1 in 3 members of the public do not feel represented still in TV in terms of age, race, gender or class. But actually on the reverse of that, nearly 3/4 of broadcast journalists say they actually struggle to get diverse guests. So it kind of suggests there's a real opportunity, I suppose, actually, where PRs can support journalists. I might come to you first and then get your thoughts on that, Theo. In terms of where there's an opportunity here for PRs to kind of work with brands in terms of finding those good spokespeople.
Yeah, opportunity and responsibility, I think, from PRs to make sure that, as Simon said, that the stories and ideas that we go out with are fully representative, and, that there's a balance of talent, or whether you're doing a survey, making sure that it's representative across all kind of communities. It's difficult, I would say, but it's something that I think as PRs that we have a responsibility to do, to make sure that it's fully representative in terms of the work that we're doing as well.
Can I just add one build?
Yeah.
What I thought was really interesting with the report is class. And it doesn't feel like it comes up as much in conversation as it should do, because I'm from London, but I don't want to just hear. I don't want to hear people look like me. I don't want to just see people who look like me. I don't want to just hear voices that sound like mine from a London accent and so on. I want to hear a mix of the country that my brand represent and that we should represent. And I think it's really important that class also came out, because I think it's important, and I don't think it's spoken about enough, because there probably still is a bit of a class issue in this country. And I think as PRs, we have to make sure that we address that, and that we really think really holistically and boldly. And I think the word that you said was opportunity, right? Part of the problem is if there isn't, we have an opportunity to put those guests forward, right? But if we don't do the work of working with the right talent, we will not address that. So I think PRs have a responsibility, as you said.
What do your thoughts on that, Theo?
I think diversity is important because it's the right thing. Right? That's the first thing to say. It's the right thing to make sure that television screens are, major programs, whether they be on the internet or social media channels or radio, wherever, they have adequate representation. I think it's the right thing that should happen. What I would also say is that, particularly in areas of politics, in areas of, and particular areas of politics as well, like defence is especially bad. It's very difficult just to get somebody who isn't white, male, middle class onto news outlets. Producers are under incredible amounts of pressure to fill space and to get guests, and are very conscious of, whoever I've worked with actually has been very conscious of actually ensuring that there is an adequate, there's adequate balance, but it can be incredibly difficult. And when I've done presenting, I've been like, guys, I'm looking at the sheet, this is like 3 men in a row, like what are we doing about it? And the producer's like, I don't have anybody else. And they're sweating it because there's nobody, there just isn't the pool to choose from. And I think just the ear is like a muscle. And if you're just all you're doing is giving the same voices, you're just pushing that in front of the muscle, then it gets lazy and it switches off. I think that's not a very eloquent way of describing it. But if you have different people with different intonation, different accents, different voices, men, women, people where you can clearly hear that they're from different backgrounds than what you might be groups you might traditionally not hear from, then automatically the ear is going to tune in. It's going to feel that differentiation, and it's going to want to hear what that individual has to say. And I just think, from a listener's point of view, diversity makes sense. If that you are going to keep the audience for longer, and you're going to keep them engaged for longer if you can do that. And for PRs, I know that broadcasters are always looking for new voices. They always are trying to find somebody who's going to come on and not just do the same shtick as everybody else. It's a real, diversity is something that everybody's on the lookout for. Just because I think apart from anything else, it makes better broadcasting.
Yeah, which I do think is really interesting, because obviously we've talked about what, the side of it that it's really important, but actually that even from the content point of view and your listening and that, about your ears and the muscles, I think that's really, really interesting. And exactly what you've said in terms of 8 in 10 journalists, what we found in our report, value commentary from experts when they're putting together their news programmes. Actually, as broadcasters are continuing to kind of be squeezed, I suppose, to some extent with their budgets and their remits are having to broaden to be making more of the content work for different platforms, actually there's a real gap and a real opportunity for PRs and brands to say, who are our expert in-house voices, what can we offer them to comment on with the news agenda, and where can they add value?
I think producers also generally find that women are much more sensible than men. So men will come on and they'll think, and you'll say, well, we want to speak about this. And they'll go, that isn't my area of expertise, but I'll speak about it anyway. Whereas I think from my experience, when people have gone for women experts, they've been like, no, this is my area of expertise. This is what I'm comfortable in speaking on. Now, who would it be for me to say, actually, there's often a point when actually broadcasters, feel that, are just dying for somebody just to be confident, just say, yes, I'll come on and I'll do it, but I'm going to frame it in this way. Don't be shy People shouldn't be shy in accepting a request and saying, okay, I'll come onto your show, but I'm gonna make this point. If that isn't going to work for your show, it doesn't work for your show. But this is what I can provide. And I think actually you'll often get producers saying, you will get some producers to say, well, actually, really, that's not going to work with this particular presenter. But I think very often you'll find producers are willing to hear new views, and will be looking for guests who can say something a bit different.
Yeah, definitely. The other thing I just want to touch on, and I'll probably do a couple more questions from me and then we'll go to our audience. So please do, if you haven't sent in any questions, please do. That would be fantastic. Is just, I don't think we can let this conversation go without talking about AI in some capacity. Because obviously, as we mentioned earlier, it's a challenge for journalists. But then we've also started to see some quite interesting creativity come from AI as well. It was last week that Mike Parkinson had sort of worked with a producer to create the Michael Parkinson virtually Michael, I can't remember the name of it now, podcast where essentially he will invite guests on and they will be interviewing the AI version, they'll be speaking to the AI version of Michael Parkinson. But it's very straight up and very honest about what it's doing and saying this is going to be AI, and then we're going to be asking guests to talk about what that experience was like. So it's fascinating to see some creative. Yeah, it's fantastic to see some creative things. Aarti, I suppose from a, you're a creative agency at Hope and Glory, the ideas that you're putting together. Are you, what are your thoughts when it comes to AI and where that can sort of play? And are you seeing some hesitation and some, where are your clients sort of, how are they feeling about AI?
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head when you talked about transparency and honesty around it. I think, as many other PR agencies, we're starting to look at the tools that we can use from an AI perspective. And, there's no doubt that it helps us be more efficient when it comes to kind of the more routine tasks, whether that's media monitoring, whether it's condensing down lots of information into bite-sized, digestible bullet points. But I think the flip side of that is being responsible about how we use it. And I'm sure Simon can speak to this, but I'm sure there is a bit of nervousness from brands and from clients about agencies using it and the way that they're using it. So I would say, transparency and being upfront about where those tools are being used. I don't think it's ever going to replace creativity, but I think what it does do is it supercharges and boosts creativity. And this is really interesting, the whole concept of that, but I think they're doing it the right way. They're being honest. It's almost like a human experiment, isn't it? What does it feel like to be interviewed by an AI? It would be so interesting.
And because I think it's also about, there's been a lot of discussion on LinkedIn about, being honest about when you've used AI as well, and actually, the nervousness in terms of, is it going to dull some kind of skill sets? And so I think, it's all things we're sort of wary of a little bit. Simon, I don't know if you've got any thoughts on AI.
I do, and it's very interesting you talked about the Michael Parkinson podcast, because I heard about it on a podcast. So clearly it's one thing works. Yes, indeed. And I found it absolutely astonishing to hear this voice note left by Michael Parkinson for Richard Osman.
Yes.
And I could not tell the difference. No. And the intonation and that Yorkshire accent, it stopped me. It actually stopped me in my tracks going, that is unbelievable. And it's unbelievable, but there's also in that case, it makes you go, well, wow. When will you know whether something's real or if it's not real, right? And in this case, we know it's not real because he's not alive anymore. But when is it that our own voices could be used? That's another conversation. I think with AI, I definitely agree with Aarti. I think we're going to have to be in a space where we're going to have to learn to live with it. I'm a big believer of, and you said it as well, Theo, if we don't embrace new technology, you won't win, right? So it's how do you use the technology, in this case AI, to support you, right? I still think I could outright a press release from AI, right? Let's have a competition between ChatGPT and myself, and I will write the better press release. And the reason that is because I'm a human, right? And I'm a great writer, thank you for asking. But more than that, it's because it's that human touch, right? It's when you're when you're, whatever you're building, it's that human emotion that AI can't get yet. So I think it's embracing it to a degree, but also being slightly guarded, right? I don't think it can replace us yet, and I don't think it should. So it's how do you work with it to boost and to value add, but not to write a better press release than myself.
Yes, no, I completely agree with you. I'm going to ask one or two more questions, and then we'll take the questions that we've had in from our audience. But as I think then, as we're sort of taking our takeaways, obviously the thing that came really prevalent in the sort of that we discussed in the final chapter of our report is actually the need to make an impact. How do you measure impact? If we look at when we surveyed the general sort of public, actually, what is it that they're doing when they see a news story or a PR campaign on the news? And actually those sort of tangible stats around impact were really interesting. 38% say they tell a work colleague or a friend, and this is after seeing a news story on TV or on social media. 29% look into the topic further. 24% say they change a behaviour or buy a product or service. There's, even though PR is notoriously difficult to kind of get those tangible kind of what is my campaign delivered beyond the fact that I've done a lovely piece on BBC Breakfast, or I've got a nice piece on the Mirror Online. So I think it's really interesting when we kind of look at that and the impact. And I just want to sort of close on this final stat, which is obviously the fact that 41% of PRs say that they don't have a broadcast strategy, despite the fact that 1 in 2 say it's the most sort of valuable kind of coverage for their clients. Aarti, I suppose some sort of final reflections from you really in terms of where broadcast sits for you and for your clients, and what you think the challenges or opportunities are going into 2025 for measuring campaigns.
I think that was a really interesting stat. I think, from all the clients that I speak to, broadcast is still seen as a bit of a pinnacle actually in terms of coverage and in terms of like where you're landing your story. It's still seen as, if you get a piece on, whether it's This Morning or BBC News, that, you're reaching a really captured audience, you're getting your message across, and it still has that kind of, you've got your product on TV, or you've got your brand spoken about on TV. So I think it's really interesting that the PRs kind of perhaps aren't looking from the very beginning, when you're starting to come up with those ideas, how are we going to make sure that this is going to land on broadcast, and how can we bake that in to the story from the very beginning so that we're able to do that?
Because the requirements are always different. We've talked about throughout this really the multiple sort of different platforms, and actually how that there's been a demand and a breadth in skill set, but actually there's still sort of nuances to each channel and the audiences and how it works and how you should be shaping the content. Simon, I don't know if you've got any.
I'd build. I think it's hearts and minds, right? Broadcast really can do the hearts and minds job. It can be so powerful. Like if we wind back the clock, the movement to get rid of plastic straws or plastic bags, it's from Attenborough, right? From people saw it on the telly. People saw it with their eyes, and it affected what happened here, and then that all of a sudden there's a ban on plastic straws because we see how bad it is for the environment. So I think broadcast is really important to me because I know that it can move people to act. One of the campaigns that I've worked on that's one of the kind of a highlight of my career, which I mentioned to you before, Sarah.
No, I'm smiling because I enjoy the story.
Because it's a great campaign. Yes, I came up with it. Which was it was to televise a children's nativity. It was a nationwide competition to televise a children's nativity narrated by a celebrity, and we, thanks to a fantastic colleague of yours who worked on the campaign, we got Stephen Mulhern talking on Good Morning Britain, and the school that entered that competition watched it on Good Morning Britain and entered as a result, and then they won. And that was a life-changing moment for a school in Carlisle. And that, for me, just sums up the power of broadcast, because it can change people's lives, and you can capture them. And I think it's in a slightly different way. I'm not going to denigrate print or online because it's really important, but I think broadcast, the message for me is as important.
Yeah, no, definitely.
I just add to that, and I think just in terms of what you were saying, I think it's hearts and minds, but also intrinsically to this, and this might be helpful for the PRs watching, it's great storytelling that sits alongside it. So when you're coming up with that idea, think about that story that you're telling. Think about David Attenborough when we had the pictures and the straws and the denigration of the environment. It was the story that he told. And just on, we were talking about AI a few moments ago. I don't see AI replacing that. That's you guys. If you can come up with a story and you can think about the pictures, the sound, where is it going to fit in, then I think there's a huge amount of opportunity, and that opportunity isn't going anywhere. It's there to be had, because broadcasters, broadcasting can be, especially on linear television, it can be incredibly expensive still, much more so than putting something into pixel. So the opportunities are there if you can support broadcasters in the right way. I think you can achieve some astounding results.
Nice. I'm just going to go now to some of the questions. Thank you to everyone who has submitted questions into our channel. I'm just going to rattle through these in the last 5 minutes that we've got. Theo, a question for you. What do you see as the major talking points for 2025 across broadcast? What are the key stories that broadcast? Trump.
Right. So yeah, it's going to be what happened in the early hours of yesterday is going to reverberate, and right into 2025. It's going to dictate the news. It's going to affect the foreign policy in this country, which will of course have a domestic impact. War in Ukraine. What does Europe do? The Middle East. How will Trump bring peace to the Middle East? I'm not, and I'd urge a bit of caution around this, and in terms of, especially with clients, things are potentially going to become more toxic, and to think about your brands quite carefully about where you're positioning yourselves and to see the pitfalls, because the pitfalls are going to, I think, probably get bigger. And I'm thinking about falling into traps, whether it's conflicts in the Middle East or closer to home. There are going to be some potential pitfalls there that I think are going to become quite stark. But overall, I think that's going to be the story of 2025, not necessarily what exactly happens in America, but how it affects the rest of the world.
And I've got a second question for you, Theo. What would be your 3 top tips, piece of advice for brands and PRs wanting to get across broadcast outlets?
Come up with a clear story. Just to my earlier point, come up with a clear story. I think I'm going to lend a little bit on what you guys were saying. Think very carefully about where you go to the end, if you like, the result. Where do you want what looks like success for you? Where you want it to be, and to think very specifically about what that broadcaster wants before you go to them, so that they feel. I think what broadcasters, journalists get really frustrated with is generic stuff. When they feel, even if it's just 5 minutes before the phone call to that particular broadcaster, think about what your pitch is to them, even if it's just tweaking the overall thing. And I think also think about what exactly what the offer is. So is it a guest? Is it the chance to, if you're going to a television studio, where are the pictures going to be? If you think about, I've worked in Sky News, and invariably I'm talking about, you go on to do the paper review and you talk about weather stories. Why are you talking about weather stories or wildfires? Because they're great pictures. So you end up talking about, they're always after pictures to fill as well. So think about, think specifically about the, what are the component parts that broadcaster is going to need to deliver something at the end of the day. Journalists are under pressure. They don't need to be, if you can give them that job, if you can have done that part of the job for them, they're going to take it.
Yeah, and we didn't touch on this, but obviously one of the parts of the report does talk about how the need to think visually more and more, even when you're thinking of radio, because a lot of radio studios now, they look a bit like TV studios, they're live streaming, they want to have their guests in vision. So there's a lot more of a visual importance really in thinking about, rather than just here's an interesting kind of research-based survey and a guest who can talk about it, but actually how do you bring it to life and create something that's visually interesting and engaging.
And likewise, television is going into radio, and we've seen that as well. They're taking the feed from the television studio and putting it into radio.
Much more sort of an amalgamation really of channels. I think we've got time for 2 more questions. Aarti, what's your sort of best piece of insight on ensuring sort of quality agency and client relationships?
Oh, interesting. I think honesty and transparency and trust as well. So I think between clients, you have to be able to trust each other. You have to know that we will give you truthful and advice when you need it. And I think that's based on the strength of the relationship as well.
And maybe I'll put this one, it says for all, but maybe I'll put it to you, Simon, just because I want to give you a question. Since the implementation of AI, have you noticed a decline on the value of the written word?
I think it's I think there's a choice, right? You make a choice as PRs and brands. Do you want to give AI that power? I don't think so, not just yet. Right? As I said earlier, I think I could outright and outcreate AI. That's not because I'm trying to be arrogant. It's because it doesn't have that human touch. It doesn't know that how's that story going to land in the Sun, or how do we I think what you were saying, like tweaking that story. How do I then, if I was going to land a story for the Sun, it's not going to work for the Times. So what is the story that would be for the Times, or if I wanted to do something regionally, is the same story that's going to work for the Manchester Evening News going to work the same for the Ilford Recorder, right? And AI can't do that. It can't do it yet. So I think AI is definitely here, and I think it's how we use it, and we can see it as a friend and as a tool. But I don't think I still think there's a lot of value in the written word. And I just want to add from the client side to what Aarti was saying. I think the best way to get the relationship from in-house with agencies is treating your agency as an extension of the team, that we are part of the same side. It's not transactional.
Yeah.
And that you can challenge the client, right? I don't have to be right. I don't have to be right. I want to get to the right answer. And I think the best conversations that you have with agency and in-house is on the same page, is honesty, that you said, not being afraid to challenge and tell them what you can, right?
Yeah.
Because it means that you can get the very best outcomes. So I just wanted to add that, because I thought it was brilliant what you were saying.
A lovely addition. I think, it's really important. And then as our final question I'll put to you, Theo, is will light-hearted stories continue to be in demand to balance the doom and gloom and the hard news?
Yeah.
Is there still a place for it next year and amongst the Trump?
Absolutely. It's a very good question, actually, and I think it's worth raising. The best presenters that I worked with during my career, I remember Nick Ferrari saying to me, and I don't think he would be fine with me saying this, right? But he said, you're putting together a radio show like a newspaper, and of course that's unsurprising given that his background was in newspapers. But you're trying to give your audience a bit of everything, because you don't, especially as news becomes so much more polarized, we become more invested in it. People become, it can cause rifts, it can cause huge divisions, but it can also bring people together when you have a great story as well. And I think, the news, we saw this, I think, going back to, 10 years now, before it started with the Brexit referendum, perhaps, so maybe a little bit shorter, but people became much more invested in news and politics. When I started covering politics, you'd say, oh, what do you do? Well, I'm a political journalist. I don't really think politics. And then suddenly with our exit from the European Union, you'd say, oh, I'm political editor at LBC. And they were like, oh, well, you'd end up chewing your ear off. And everybody had an opinion about it. And I don't think, with what we had with the pandemic, and now the resurgence of Donald Trump in America, that isn't going away anytime soon. But I think people also need some light relief, and it's quite, I can sometimes, and certainly when I was working full time in journalism, you can come to the end of a week and having been in the news all week just feel quite emotionally drained, and I think the same is just as it is for journalists. I think the same is for audiences as well. If all their broadcasters or news outlets that are just providing bad news, they need and smart editors get this. They need to think about exactly what they're putting their audience through, and if they think about it carefully, they come to the conclusion that as well as shade, you need quite a bit of light as well.
Definitely. Thank you so much, everybody. That's all we've got time for. We could go on and talk about so much more, but I think we're going to have to leave it there. But thank you so much for joining me this afternoon to talk about our annual report. We thank you so much, everybody who's joined us online. I hope you found this useful. This is obviously the first that we're going to be sharing as part of this series of sharing our insights and stats that we've pulled together in our annual report. There should be a quick poll coming up on your screens now. Please do fill that out, especially if you are interested in one of the follow-up sessions, the broadcast surgeries that our team is offering. Thank you again for joining, and do keep an eye on our social channels for the next Broadcast Revolution event. Thank you.